Hi there, and welcome to Lesson 18 in our program entitled Leadership at the Points of Contact. In this section of the program, we're focusing on the third key leadership role, and that is to facilitate continuous process improvement. And the name I've given to that process is the Relentless Search for Better Ways. In this section, I'm going to be sharing with you some ideas, some suggestions I have for how you can facilitate that process. Now, so far in this section, we have established some basic agreements. First of all, the external factors that impact your organization's performance change. Two, as those external factors change, so do the requirements for achieving and sustaining organizational success. In order to deal with the changes, you've got to make some changes. And three, in order for that to happen, you as leaders must facilitate that process. So what I want to do in this lesson is look at process improvement kind of in general, with specific attention to what I see as the phases of process improvement and the two approaches that we see used most often where process improvement is concerned. First, the phases. As I see it, there are three phases to process improvement: the creative phase, the implementation phase, and the fine-tuning phase. The creative phase is where, in the context of what we're going to be talking about in subsequent lessons, this is where you and your associates come together and identify the internal processes that you feel like need to be improved. You identify alternatives to the status quo, in other words, changes you'd like to make to those internal processes, and then you and your associates develop actionable plans for making those changes. That's the creative phase. The second phase is implementation. It's self-explanatory. This is where you and your associates convert the actionable plans into action. And finally, the third phase is fine-tuning. Keep in mind, the title I've given to this process improvement dynamic is the Relentless Search for Better Ways, and that word relentless should be a giveaway here. We can't realistically expect that we're going to come up with a happily ever alternative to a process that couldn't have been happily ever after in the first place. Make sense? We understand that as the external factors continue to change, we must continuously fine-tune the processes that we have in place or that we develop for the purpose of dealing with those external factors. So the three phases: creative, implementation, and fine-tuning. The second thing I wanted to touch on in this lesson are what I see as the two approaches being used for process improvement. The first is top-down, and the second is collaborative. And in my experience, the top-down is by far the more popular. Not more effective, mind you, but far more popular, even among members of leadership teams who pay lip service to the collaborative approach. When push comes to shove, too often what we see is only a variation of the top-down. And the top-down approach can be viewed from the perspective of those three phases. The creative phase. In the top-down approach, the creative phase, participation in that phase is limited to people in executive level positions or leadership, formal leadership positions, okay? The fine-tuning phase is likewise limited in terms of who gets to participate. Staff, employees, their participation is limited almost exclusively to the implementation. So they're excluded from the creative and the fine-tuning. The collaborative approach, on the other hand, broadly expands employee participation. Remember in the previous section of the course I talked about how can we expand and enhance employee engagement. And one manifestation of that would be broader employee participation in this process improvement dynamic. So in the collaborative approach, which I espouse and we'll be talking about, staff, the people whose efforts are required to implement whatever sort of plans are created, will also be actively involved in the creative phase, certainly the implementation phase, but as well, they will be actively involved in the fine-tuning phase. They will bring a perspective, an operational or a tactical perspective to the creative phase that does several things. Key among them It will almost always produce plans that are more implementable. I may have just made that word up, but that are more readily implemented. It will, by virtue of their having participated in the creative phase, dramatically reduce the amount of time and effort required to sell people on participating in implementation, and ultimately it'll produce better results. Let's look at the action items for this lesson. As a way of preparing you for the next 4 lessons, I want you and the members of your leadership team to identify 3 or 4 internal processes that are especially important to your organization's success. Next, I want you to identify staff members with operational experience with each of those processes. Those would be people, employees, who have real-world perspectives on those processes. Now, the action items, as you know by now, are very, very important components of this program. The action items for this lesson, remember, are things I want you and the members of your leadership team to do. Don't reach out to any of these employees just yet. We're going to get to that. But complete these 2 steps in the action items because they really, really do set you up for what we're going to be covering in far more detail in subsequent lessons. And that's where we'll pick up in the next one.